All right. Can everybody still hear me? Would someone mind putting in the question box an answer? Thank you. So you can use that question box at any time during our presentation to say, Jay, that wasn't clear. Jay, you broke up. Jay, I need a clarification. So please do not hesitate to do this. But I just want to remind everybody why we're here. This is the CAS training series. This is a webinar series, part 1 of 2 on system performance measures pertaining to our continuum of care. And these are the HUD prescribed continuum of care system performance measures. Really what we're doing today is a overview about what they are, what the metrics exactly are, and why they're being used as proxy measurements of our progress as a continuum of care. Part 2 will go into more detail about the ins and outs of individual program types and how they may have an impact or be impacted by the relative participation that they have or impact that they have on the system performance of the COC. You can see that you can still register for the part 2, which is Tuesday the 28th of May, starting at 10 a.m. But we're going to jump into today's webinar, and I would remind you again, if you have a question, put it in the question box. I'll try and address all of them as I go, and otherwise at the end we'll pause for a refresher of some of the questions that we've gone over or any new ones you may want to introduce. The first question that we're addressing today is, what are system performance measures? Now, in my effort to give you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, I am using exclusively materials published by our friends at the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. I did not create separate spreadsheets. I'm going to go straight through the stuff from the horse's mouth. So to that end, this is a document called System Performance Measures in Context. If you wanted to look it up for yourself, okay, you can find basically this is an overview provided by HUD as to what system performance measures do and what they are. So you can see that there are 7 that have been developed thus far for the continuum of care, and they start with length of time persons remain homeless in our continuum, the extent to which those persons who exit to permanent housing from a homeless location return again to homelessness, the number of total homeless persons in the continuum, jobs and income growth for those persons that are in COC funded projects. So you see that the universe changes a little bit there. And then number of persons who become homeless for the first time, homeless prevention and housing placement of persons defined by category 3 of HUD's homeless definition. Number 6, this 6th system performance measure is actually not being utilized anywhere in the country yet. Okay, because this is a measure or a metric that pertains only to high-performing communities. So those are communities that achieve a certain level of proficiency and performance in reducing overall homelessness and having very, very quick and rapid response to getting folks housed. No community in the entire country has been designated as a high-performing community. So metric number 6, we're kind of going to gloss over because it's not pertinent to anybody yet, even though it's a nice thing to aspire to. And then number 7 is successful housing placement from the various programs that we are already implementing in our continuum of care. Okay, so these are the system measures themselves, and we'll get into the depth of them in a moment. But the first question that we have is what. The second is, what are the exact metrics? We've already kind of glossed on 2 of them, but the third one is the one I want to get into that was advertised, and that is, why does HUD use them? Okay, this is straight from the horse's mouth what HUD thinks about why they are using system performance measures. There are 7 system performance measures because HUD believes that really just creating new housing, or just improving income, or just providing services, or just doing any one of the things that may move these metrics is not a complete picture. And the goal, as you can see here, is that the purpose of the measures is to provide a more complete picture of how well a community is preventing and ending homelessness. Let me see if I can zoom in for you so that you can get a little bit closer to the actual words, and they're actually visible to our good friends who may be viewing this at a later date. Okay, so the purpose of these measures is to provide a more complete picture of how well a community is preventing and ending homelessness. That's the goal. That's really the bottom line of what HUD is trying to accomplish here. And if you are keen to agree with them, then you might be able to see as we go through our webinar why these particular measures do a good job of that. But it does its own job of narrating that here in the HUD guidance. It says, obviously, if you have fewer homeless persons in your jurisdiction, that means you're reducing overall homelessness. So that's measure number 3. Okay, if you're reducing the number of folks who are becoming homeless for the first time, then that's going to reduce number 3, the overall number of people. If the number of those who experience renewed episodes of homelessness is reduced, then you're obviously going to reduce the number of folks who are homeless. It's all about, you know, kind of linking these metrics all together. And that's kind of what HUD is trying to say, is that if you are getting someone housed quickly, so they're, you know, in metric 1, their length of homelessness is short, then, you know, they're having a better opportunity to not lose wages and get better, quicker links to employment. And they're more likely to be successful the less time they spend in homelessness, the data show. So this is HUD's, again, explanation. We're going to try and help you guys make your own determination about why these system performance measures may or may not be the right ones, and what they're telling us about our system. But we're going to start diving into the actual metrics themselves. I just wanted to make sure you guys had an overview, again, straight from HUD, about why they think these measures are relevant. The other thing I wanted to emphasize before we get going, and we'll talk about this more in the next webinar, but this is really not the only reason why HUD wants to have these system performance measures, okay? They have the word performance in them. And really what HUD is trying to emphasize is that they are measuring communities for how well they're doing, right? It's not just a system benchmark. It is not just a fun thing to think about how we're making progress. HUD is really using these measures to make decisions about the direction it's going to go in making funding allocation and determining where to put its resources. And it is prescribing that the continuums of care at the local level are going to do the same thing, that we as a continuum are going to be looking at our data, looking at our system performance, seeing whether an intervention is making the numbers go the right way or the wrong way, and then, you know, building a system that is made to create positive outcomes and better achievement every time we look at these data in system performance. All right, so keep that in mind. This is not just a fun thing to look at and feel good about ourselves. This is more and more having an implication for how we are allocated funds and for what purpose. Okay, HUD is going that direction. So we're moving on, and we're going to dive right into the what are these metrics. Okay, the resource that I'm showing you here is called the Introductory Guide to System Performance Measures, and this is, again, a resource directly provided by HUD. And the reason that we're going through it in this way is because it is going to explain in very particular detail what the measures are and what it pertains to. All right, so we already talked about that first measure, and it is reduction in the average and median length of time persons remain homeless. So we talked that it's length of time persons remain homeless. What it's specifically measuring as part of this measurement overall is two things: the average length and the median length of persons who are experiencing homelessness. And there's two separate universes, okay? So you can see here, metric 1.1 is all of the persons in emergency shelter and safe haven projects during any given operating period or reporting period. So if you have a 12-month period, you're going to look at all the people that were in emergency shelter programs and safe haven programs during that year, and you're going to measure what was the average length of time the people in those programs spent in a homeless situation during that time frame. Okay, so that's what this measure is looking at. Measure 1.2, slightly different universe. It includes our transitional housing programs in addition to our emergency shelter and safe haven programs. Now, before I go further, just to be clear, we are only measuring programs that are in our HMIS or are contributing to our overall system performance calculation. Okay, as you all may well know, there are a number of programs in our COC that are both COC funded or are non-COC funded who do not participate in the HMIS. And the way that the system performance measures are calculated and structured to be utilized is through the HMIS system, or Homeless Management Information System. So really what we're looking at is we may not in any given snapshot period be looking at all emergency shelter and safe haven project types or all emergency shelter and transitional housing types. It's probably not going to include our partners at the Victim Service Provider Agency. It's probably not going to look at some of our partners who are not COC or otherwise funded by our county and COC and may have some ancillary programs that are not in the HMIS. So keep that in mind. It's not always complete and it's not always telling you everything about everyone, but I just wanted to make sure that everybody is aware that this is not actually something that's calculated for every program. It's every program that's contributing to the HMIS. Okay, that's the way it's set up currently. But you can see that metric 1.1 is average and median for emergency shelter and safe haven. Metric 1.2, emergency shelter, safe haven, and transitional housing. So why is this important? In HUD's eyes, right? In HUD's eyes, the average length of time that people are spending and the median length of time are really important because it's going to actually describe how quickly we are able to pair people with the resources that they need to get back into permanent housing. Okay. Research and data show that the quicker that an individual or household is able to stabilize in permanent housing, the less likely they are to have to come back to another unsheltered or sheltered homeless location again. That the quicker they're housed, the less likely they are to come back again. And so one of the things that this measure is really important for, and it is in HUD's eyes, it's linked to the next measure, which is about recidivism, quote unquote, or returns to homelessness more appropriately. You know, recidivism, it denotes you've done something wrong in some cases, but that's not what we're talking about. We're just talking about falling back into a homeless situation. But also really relevant to keep in mind is the difference that these two measures can have. For instance, in emergency shelter and safe haven, you may have very different average lengths of stay than when you add in our transitional housing programs. Different of our programs in our community have different limits on how long people can stay in them. And so it has an implication on the average length of time people spend in homeless situations. And HUD looks at those things. So that's measure 1 on length of homelessness, both average and median. Okay, those are reported to HUD with system performance. Measure 2, okay, this is 2A, the extent to which persons who exit to permanent housing destinations return to homelessness, and this is within a 6 to 12 month time frame. Okay, so when we run a system performance report, we're not just running data in our HMIS system from the current year. In fact, the data is over a 3-year window. It goes all the way back to 2 years prior to the operating date or the start date of our report to look at who did we house 2 years ago that may have come back in the subsequent 6 to 12 months and then in the subsequent 24 months. So the HMIS data is really being used in this measure longitudinally. It's really looking at the history that each unique individual who we served might, you know, have had in the course of our service to them in the COC. So you can see in metric 2A1, and both of these metrics, by the way, have the exact same, you know, type of person, okay, persons who have exited to permanent housing destinations. However, there's one important difference, and instead of adding in transitional housing, right, over here we have returns to street outreach, which would be a homeless location, emergency shelter, safe haven, transitional housing, all homeless locations, after having previously exited from a homeless location to a permanent housing destination. So an example of someone that would fall into this category would be someone who left a shelter, maybe a family, and they got permanently housed. Maybe they got rapid rehousing, or they got a TRA, temporary rental assistance of some sort. They went and had a lease in their own name, and at discharge, we said they went to a permanent housing location, but then they return to either a street outreach, emergency shelter, safe haven, or transitional housing program over the course of the next 6 to 12 months after they've exited. Okay, that's who we're talking about here. Over here, we're talking about the same time frame, someone who's returned after 6 to 12 months, but we're also including those folks who have left from a permanent housing program to another permanent housing destination. So this is folks who maybe they got a permanent supportive housing voucher, and we served them and we housed them and we were successful. And in fact, we were so successful that they gained income and they were able to live independently. We discharged them. They no longer needed subsidy. But 6 to 12 months later, they came back into a homeless location. Or maybe it was someone who was transitioned to a Section 8 voucher because they no longer needed support services for their disabling condition, but then they lose that subsidy or are unable to maintain their housing with that subsidy, and they come back into our homeless system in 6 to 12 months. All right, so that's this measure 2A, okay? And again, 2A is for the 6 to 12 month window. 2B, you will see, is extremely similar, okay? However, the difference is that we're, instead of in a 6 to 12 month horizon, going up to a 24-month horizon, okay? So we're talking about returns to street outreach, emergency shelter, safe haven, and transitional housing programs after exits to permanent housing destinations, okay? So this is a really important distinction, because this is actually going back 2 years, not just 6 to 12 months. Maybe people are staying stably housed for a year, but maybe within 2 years they've been destabilized. So again, same distinction between adding in permanent housing over here with metric 2B2. So it's an important consideration. One of the things I want to point out here, particularly pertaining to your particular COC's homeless system, is it seems like this measure is a great thing, right, in terms of giving us perspective on how, whether or not we're reducing the number of persons over time who, once we discharge them to permanent housing, ever come back. Okay, however, as we said in measure 1, this is only data that is as good as the programs and projects that are set up in our HMIS system to gather the data. So let me spotlight on a couple of these program types. Okay, so transitional housing, excuse me, I'm assuming everybody understands that that's a program with a limit of up to 24 months of project-based assistance for homeless individuals and families. Safe Haven is a more intensive overnight stay, more of a intensive shelter option, but it's also a programmatic model. And then emergency shelter and street outreach. But what I want to zone in on is street outreach. Okay, so let's say that you have a client who exited your transitional housing program 2 years ago and they went to permanent housing. Okay, if they actually have exited and left your system, but then they come back and they go to a program that provides food, like a food pantry, and they are living in their car because they've fallen back into homelessness. Really, right now, we don't have, unless a street outreach program has interfaced with them, or they go into an emergency shelter, safe haven, or transitional housing program, we don't yet know about that person's return to homelessness, okay? Even if they call our coordinated entry system, Right now, based on this system performance measure, the way it's not structured to include persons who return to supportive services only programs or coordinated entry programs. It's structured only to count persons who return to a program that is designated as homeless within our system, in our HMIS. So this may not include some folks who you all may be interfacing with on a daily basis, maybe at one of the drop-in centers, maybe even in your program at the front desk of intake or receiving calls. It may not actually capture everyone who returns to homelessness. Again, think about the limitations of our HMIS system. Not every program that interfaces with homeless individuals on a day-to-day basis is labeled as street outreach. So keep that in mind about the limitations of this permanent housing destination returns. And again, you know, you might want to inquire in your own agency about how your programs are set up and whether it makes sense to set them up as street outreach or emergency shelter. We have a lot of programs that provide services and case management that are set up as supportive services only programs. That's totally fine. However, if we're talking about system performance as a priority and we want to figure out how to get all of our metrics to work in that direction, including those of you who work with the Coordinated Entry Committee and are doing case conferencing and are really working consistently to try to work with folks who are falling into homeless situations or are long-term homeless, sometimes our data doesn't always fully describe the way the situation is improving or staying the same or not improving. And a lot of it is based on how we set up our system and set up our projects. So just want to make sure that everybody's aware about that. This is measure 2B, the second part of returns to homelessness. Obviously, one of the things that is a really important thing for HUD is that when you end someone's homelessness, that you end it for good. USICH, which is the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness, has a saying that the goal of the homeless response or crisis response system is to make homelessness rare, which is making it sound like you're going to prevent it as much as possible. Brief, which is the length of homelessness being limited, and then non-recurring, so that people don't actually ever return back to homelessness. So someone told me I was breaking up a little bit. I apologize. I always do call in onto these webinars so that my voice is pretty clear, but please don't hesitate to let me know if you need clarification. Thank you for our participants in the question box. All right, so we're on to measure 3, number of homeless persons. This is pretty straightforward. In any given time frame, how many persons are we serving? And this can be any given point in time or over the course of time. When we submit to HUD, we're actually submitting a point in time count, which corresponds with our annual point in time in January, but we're also submitting a total number of homeless persons throughout the course of a year for the reporting period. So we're not just talking about numbers on a single date, which, as you all know, may be hit or miss depending on how robust our count is and whether folks are actually able to be identified. Instead, it's also looking at the total number of persons overall. And so we're talking about here the number of homeless persons. You can see that the way that HUD phrases these metrics is in terms of change. Okay, I'm told that my call in breaking up is getting worse. Can somebody else please chime in and tell me whether you are having audio issues? Okay, so I'm getting an agreement. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pause and I'm going to call back in from a different line. Okay, so hang with me for just a moment. I apologize for the difficulty and I will be right back. All right. Can everybody hear me? And is this better? Yes. I got a yes. Better. I got a yes. A yes. Okay. I apologize for that. I don't know what that was. So thanks for bearing with me. All right. So continuing on, we have metric. We've already done these for the reduction in total number of persons who are experiencing homelessness. But as you can see, HUD phrases it in terms of change. Really, again, about performance measures, HUD is really trying to look at your track record year over year, time period over time period. So it's not just about grading ourselves in the present moment, it's about grading ourselves in perspective from where we came from. So if we had 500 homeless people last year, we want to be way below 500 this year if we can. And that includes, as you can see here, sheltered and unsheltered persons. Okay, HUD also further, of course, breaks it down into other subpopulations like veterans, like persons who are chronically homeless. So it's a really important measure for HUD in terms of the overall number of homeless persons. Okay, now this is where it gets complicated with the employment and income growth, as you can see. But it does make pretty intuitive sense if you stick with me for a moment, okay? As you can well imagine, and as you probably all very well know, especially in your community where you have very high costs of housing, a great predictor of future success in not returning back to homelessness from being housed or in being sustainable long term is linkage to employment and income growth for persons who are being discharged and for persons who are working through our existing programs. So we want to link people to income and both from wages and or non-employment income as quickly as possible. And the way that this is measured in HUD's metric, again from HMIS Data, this is specific to a universe, as you can see here, of COC program funded projects. Okay, so if you are an emergency shelter or a transitional housing program that is not COC funded, you will not be included in this metric in the COC system performance. That's not to say it's not important that we connect folks with income, obviously, in your projects, because it's very likely that if they start in your project, they may wind up in somebody else's in our COC's permanent supportive housing project, and we'll want to make sure they have income there, or a transitional housing project, or in our safe haven programs and rapid rehousing programs. So really important measure, and one of the most difficult to actually get complete data for, and I'll explain why. Okay, so first you can see metric 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Again, this is measuring the increase in percentage of adults in these program types that they've described that are COC funded who gain or increase employment or non-employment income over time. Okay, and it says cash income, so we're not talking about food stamps. Okay, so let's go to metric 4.1, change in employment income during the reporting period for system stayers. So if I run a report for system performance measures for a year-long period, a 12-month period, this is all the people who didn't actually get discharged to permanent housing or didn't exit. Okay, everybody who's a system stayer, that's what it's talking about here. Okay, and this measure is specifically talking about change in employment income. Okay, so this would be, was there a positive change in the number of persons or the percentage of persons that have actually attained or increased employment income? Okay, 4.2, change in non-employment cash income. So that would be connections to things like SSI or SSD or other sorts of maybe Social Security, other forms of non-employment cash income that we could potentially link someone who is eligible to. And so, you know, that's what it's measuring here. Again, for system stayers, persons who are staying in our COC funded projects of these designations. Okay. And you can see we're talking about folks who have been in for at least a year and are still in the system by the end of the reporting period. Okay, so these are the longer term stayers. And what it's really germane for, if you think about our system, on average, the majority of the folks who have been in our HMIS system for at least a year are the folks who are here in permanent supportive housing. So this program type has an outsized impact on this measure, right? So that's why it's so critical, and we'll talk about where this is pulling from. But for you folks who operate permanent supportive housing programs, you guys have a really outsized impact on this COC performance measure. And so the way that HUD actually calculates it, we're going to go down, spoiler alert, okay? It actually uses the total number of adults in the universe that we just described, which would be in those COC funded program types and have been at least in HMIS for a year. And then the number of adults who gained or increased income during the reporting period over the total number. Okay, so it's a percentage of all the adults. Let's say there were 10 adults in permanent supportive housing in 2018, and 2 of them either gained or increased their earned income, and 8 of them had no change. We would be at a 20% increase, okay? So that's pretty simple. But the way that it's calculated, again, it's all based on Homeless Management Information System, HMIS data. So if your permanent supportive housing program did not update that client's income when they got a cost of living adjustment of $5 for their SSI benefit, or forgot to do their income recalculation when their lease got renewed in the HMIS, maybe you did it in your files and you adjusted their portion of the rent accordingly because they got more hours at their job or their increased benefit amount went up, but you didn't record it in the HMIS, we don't get credit for it as a system. The COC loses out on that information. So if you don't record employment income, or if you don't report non-employment income, when those queues come up at income update time for permanent supportive housing, which is every year at the renewal point for that client, then we miss out. Okay. The third metric that it's looking at here is change in the total amount. So let's say that you, again, with our example of 2 individuals who had increased income out of 10 that were in a permanent supportive housing program, 20% increased income. Let's say that was only employment income, 0% increased non-employment income, and each of those individuals increased the amount of income that they had by $100. Okay, so what this metric is going to calculate is it is going to calculate the amount per average individual that the incomes were increased. Okay, so basically if we just are getting cost of living adjustments with SSI, this number is going to be very low. But if we're linking people to income, or we're linking people to increased amounts of income, then those, maybe you're reunifying a family with a household member that has greater income, those are things that have a big impact on overall changes in total cash income. Okay, now moving over here to metric 4.4, this is for leavers. So this is for anybody who within the time that we're running the report left and exited, whether they went to a homeless location or they went to a permanent housing location. It doesn't matter. As long as they left, we want to know what they had in their pocket on their way out the door and whether it was increased, as you can see here, changed, whether it changed from their entry point to their exit of the system. So let's say that they came into our emergency shelter with $150 or $160 a month in income, and all of a sudden, by the time they left our shelter, they were getting $1,000 a month in income because we had linked them to the benefits that they were eligible for, or we had also helped them out with getting a part-time job. That's really where that change would be, but it would only be counted as a leaver if during the window of time that we ran this report for, let's say a 12-month period, the person was only in our shelter for 6 months and then they left, they'd be count as a system leaver. Okay, and then over here you have change in non-employment income. So that would be, again, any benefits that they're linked to that are sources of income, like SSI, SSD, TANF, GA, etc. In metric 4.6, again, it's the same thing as metric 4.3, just for non-employment income. So it's the relative increase in proportion with the total number of persons. So basically it's average increase per person overall for the system leavers. Okay, and as you can see, again, it's still COC funded projects. So that's why for our COC funded partners, I mean, we all as a system have an incentive to help make those folks, to help give those folks successful connection to increased income, increased linkage to mainstream resources and income, and to get them on their way in better shape than when they came in, to link them to something that's going to strengthen their chances at not returning to homelessness and being sustainable long term. Again, that's ultimately HUD's thinking behind the metric. Okay, so moving on. Metric number 5, reduction in the number of persons who become homeless for the first time. This is an increasingly critical measure. Okay, for those of you who are on the webinar, I believe that most of you, based on me looking at who registered here, are familiar with the concept of diversion, and or you've done it yourself. You've had a conversation with someone saying, do you really want to come into shelter, or do you really absolutely have to come into my emergency shelter, or do you need a hotel motel voucher tonight? You really have nowhere else to go? Do you have any resources that we can figure out how to leverage and how to make you avail yourself of, in order that you don't actually ever have to become homeless by HUD's definition in my homeless response system? You don't ever have to touch, as you can see here, emergency shelter, safe haven, or transitional housing projects. You don't ever have to enroll in one of those programs, because we've assisted you, whether it's with some prevention dollars like SSH, or like TRA, EA, or like some other form of assistance that we may have. Maybe it's something with back rent, something with energy bills. Those are all things that prevent and divert homeless persons from stay in permanent housing where they're at. Maybe it's a reunification or intervention in a dispute within a household, and making sure that that household doesn't break up. So this is why reduction in the number of persons who become homeless for the first time is such a huge measure. And if you think about it, in the overarching place within the system performance measure framework that HUD has established, let's say that you decrease this number, the number of people who have never been in HMIS before, so you've never seen them before, and last year you had 100 people who came in to your shelter for the first time, and this year you had 50 people who had never ever been in shelter before. What would that say about how many people are actually experiencing homelessness? Well, if your overall numbers decreased by 50 as well and corresponded, then you would say we are having a huge impact, and we are helping people not have to come into the system. We're saving and prioritizing our resources to keep people in permanent housing even before they ever have to become homeless. That's a great thing. But if your numbers, even though you reduced first-time homeless, stay the same. Let's say you reduced your first-time homeless number by 50, but you had 250 homeless people overall last year, and you have 250 people homeless this year. What that says is that you have actually more people that are having repeat episodes of homelessness. So you may be doing a great job at diverting people, but you're actually maybe not doing a great job at keeping people sustainable, even if you've diverted them or if you've placed them out of homelessness. So, you know, those are the types of things that fit together in this framework where it really helps you identify when you're analyzing the overarching numbers from year to year with system performance, where you might want to have an impact and where you might want to use your resources to try to have a big impact. Another really important one here is, again, this change in universe. You can see that metric 5.1 is just for emergency shelter, safe haven, and transitional housing projects. And this one is emergency shelter 5.2, safe haven, transitional housing, and permanent housing. That includes permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing. Okay, so the critical piece here is that there could be folks who are entering into homelessness for the first time and they've come into a permanent housing project, right? So that would be interesting to us in a way. We would say, well, where did they come from if they weren't in our homeless programs and their first experience in a homeless program is in permanent housing? Well, it goes back to what we said before about project setup. Can we think of an example, those of us who are in the coordinated entry process, of where someone's first actual HMIS entry into one of these project types would be permanent supportive housing? I think we could absolutely. Maybe someone who is on the street and is not PATH eligible or is not interacting with the PATH team, so they're not in a street outreach program, and they won't go into shelter, and they are ineligible for safe haven and transitional housing. If we don't put that person straight into permanent housing of some sort, we're never going to have them in our HMIS system. So it's just interesting to see the interplay of these metrics, and it really helps us drill down on how our system is functioning when we look at whether or not there's information you know, that we might be missing that is impactful to these numbers. All right. Just so you know, I'm going to keep going. We're almost done because this is a measure that doesn't apply. I'm going to keep going until I see some really, you know, questions that need addressing in the sidebar, and if you have any of those, make sure you put them in at this time. If you want, you can just put a note in there in the question bar and say, "Dear Jay, I want to address the team and put myself out there on the phone." I can unmute you if you would like to address that in a verbal way. Just let me know in the question bar if you have any questions or if you want to express any thoughts. Okay, I'll just go over this one very quickly and we'll move on to the last one because this one's not germane. Homeless prevention and housing placement of persons defined by Category 3 of HUD's homeless definition in COC program funded projects. So the reason this isn't pertinent is because right now HUD limits our use of COC program funded projects to serving people who are literally homeless. That would be Category 1 or Category 4. Okay, persons who are fleeing domestic violence or persons who are on the street in emergency shelter or in transitional housing. Okay, if we become a high-performing community, which I don't have off the top of my head all of the metrics, but it means that you are actively reducing at 5% or more per annum the total number of homeless individuals, and you have the capacity to house folks within 20 days once they become homeless in your system. Those are just a couple of the pieces of data that would need to be documented, and you would have to show HUD that you've reached that benchmark in order to be designated a high-performing community. If we get to that point someday, Lord willing, then that means that we would then be able to apply to HUD to use our COC money differently. We would be able to say, hey, we're doing such a great job getting people housed quickly that we want to start using our COC project money to prevent homelessness. So like we talked about in the earlier measure about diversion and prevention, we want to start using this money to house people where they are before they even become homeless. If you think about it, right now we can't use COC program money for that. We can only use other monies, maybe your ESG or your SHUSH or your, you know, locally funded initiatives. So that's one threshold that nobody has attained yet, but eventually that's where HUD wants to go. They want to have crisis response systems that are so advanced that we can measure things like this with our COC money, preventing returns to homelessness within 24 months among this subset of families and youth, which would be those who have already been served and meet this definition, okay, under Category 3 of the homeless definition. So It's a really advanced metric, and it's something that is really exciting to think about starting to measure. Hey, how cool would it be if we knew how successful we were in preventing homelessness, right? That's the next step after knowing that we are successful in ending sustainably and quickly the people's homelessness who we're dealing with at this time with our COC crisis response, okay? So on to the last measure, and this is ultimately the biggest one, okay? The biggest one is ultimately, have we placed people in permanent housing? Did they get permanently housed? Okay, and you can see that it's broken down by what program of origin we're talking about, okay? So again, in HMIS data, did our street outreach program discharge folks to permanent housing destinations? Did we actually get someone who was high priority on our coordinated entry list linked directly from the street into a permanent housing location? Okay, so that's what we're looking at in metric 7A. And change in placements. Did we do better this year than we did last year? Last year, we only placed one guy directly from the street into permanent supportive housing. Maybe that's because we had high barriers to entry in our permanent supportive housing, or we had no availability or turnover. Or it didn't meet the definitions that we needed in order to house the people we had on the street. Maybe we sought to address those issues, and in the next year, we were able to house 10 or 15 people directly from street outreach programs who were PATH involved, et cetera, and put them directly into permanent housing. How exciting would that be to see an improvement in that metric? Okay. Increase in the percent of people who exit to or retain permanent housing. Okay, so this is still for, just exits, but instead of just being street outreach, now we're looking at the rest of our system, okay? Except for, you can see over here, this is going to get to permanent housing of all types, but this is just from emergency shelter, safe haven, transitional housing, and rapid rehousing projects. So of these responses, these programs, how many persons are exiting to permanent housing locations? Okay, so it's a percentage, right? It's saying there were, let's say there were 100 people that left all of these program types in this year, in this 12-month period. And out of those 100 people, 60 of them went to a permanent housing destination, okay? Maybe they got a voucher. Maybe they solved their own homelessness with our assistance and they got enough income to get a housing on their own. That's what we're measuring. And if we got 60% this year, can we get it higher next year by increasing people's income, by lowering barriers to some of our permanent housing locations so that the folks who are exiting don't have to time out of our transitional housing or our safe haven or our shelter, and instead they're able to quickly get linked and they don't have to fall back into homelessness on the street or in an emergency shelter of a different sort. They're actually going to a permanent housing destination. Okay, and then this side of the equation, metric 7B2, is talking about all permanent housing, including those who are permanent supportive housing, except rapid rehousing. So whereas rapid rehousing is included over here, it's just all permanent housing project types except rapid rehousing. So this would include other permanent housing that's not necessarily having intensive supports, but also our permanent supportive housing projects. So that's why it's so critical to measure this, because we're really, really hoping that anybody who's leaving permanent supportive housing is going to permanent supportive housing or permanent housing locations, that we don't leave anybody who has been served in permanent housing that we thought was going to end their homelessness comes back into returning to homelessness. That goes back to our returns to homelessness measure as well. Okay, so that is our measure. This is our measure of success, is whether or not folks that we are directly interacting with and are in a homeless situation are actually getting to and retaining permanent housing. Let's say they're in a permanent supportive housing project and they stay there. That's a success. That's what we're measuring. You can retain permanent housing and have that be a success if they stay as stayers during the operating period. But if they do leave, we want them to exit to a permanent destination. Okay? So that ends our summary of what are the metrics for for the system performance measures. We already went over a little bit of why does HUD use them, but I want to re-emphasize that briefly just to kind of bookend our presentation until I see that anyone has any further questions. As I said before, this is being recorded, so hopefully we'll be able to distribute the recording to everyone for your enjoyment distribution to your colleagues if they're interested. And don't miss out on our second issue, which I'll put up the information for in a moment. Couple things that I want to emphasize. I touched on it, but just so everybody is again on the same page about it, I want to emphasize this. For COCs to actually accurately assess their project performance and their system performance, they must ensure their data are as complete and accurate as possible, from data entry to report generation. So just so all of you are clear, and we'll touch a bit on this in the next presentation, HMIS data is absolutely crucial. And your team's assistance in making that happen, and the data quality committee being prudent about monitoring how we're doing on that, those are critical pieces toward directly impacting whether or not our numbers are going in a direction that shows, that is truly indicative of whether we're making progress or not. And as we said before, there's kind of two primary reasons for the system performance measures, right? HUD's using the data as a selection criteria for the NOFA. I mean, that's just, that's just crucial to remember. And then secondly, as you can see here, the ultimate goal for us in some ways, aside from how we're doing in the HUD competition, is whether or not we're making real progress. And whether or not we know that what we're doing is actually having the impact that we think it's having. I think it's really critical. A lot of times, even in my own experience, in my own kind of rush to think I know what's making an impact, I may say, oh, well, of course we need more permanent supportive housing for the chronically homeless, or of course we need rapid rehousing for families. The crucial bit is that really, we need to be making sure that when we make those decisions, we're not just doing it entirely anecdotally. And with the system performance measures, we could tomorrow start up a new permanent supportive housing project and see a year from now that actually our numbers did not improve. And then we have to ask the tough question of, why did we not see improvement when we thought we did this intervention that was going to be low barrier and actually solve homelessness for a large number of folks? And what are the issues there? Or why aren't they being successful, and why are they returning to homelessness? Is our program really low barrier? So there's all of these interplays, and it's hard to parse them out, but it's really important that everyone is able to be fluent to a degree in the conversation about what these measures are, all 7 of them. And I'll put up the summary of them again, so you can see them in front of you in case anyone wants to ask any closing questions here. I did get one question earlier asking that I just re-emphasize the jobs and income growth piece and how that's calculated. So if you're in a permanent supportive housing program and you're serving clients with that type of project, the really critical piece is to update their income at least annually or as their income changes. I can't really emphasize that enough. That is the single largest reason why the numbers are impacted in the COC in system performance for income growth. It also, in our transitional housing programs, I believe that there's a requirement that at least every 6 months that there be a checkup to make sure that folks may or may not have the resources to to be sustainable on their own. And I think that that's the threshold for transitional housing, is updating income on at least a 6-month basis. But regardless of what type of project you're using, if you're COC funded, everything you do in the HMIS obviously has an impact, but especially for the income growth, if you're helping your client investigate possible opportunities for increasing income, even if it's marginal, it can have a really big impact on net, because there's not like giant numbers of people in our permanent supportive housing. And if we start moving the needle 1, 2, 4, 5, 10 people at a time in a given operating year in the right direction, our percentages are going to improve drastically. And it can have a really great impact for the COC, and maybe even for the clients who might be able to be more sustainable and independent, which is obviously our ultimate hope and goal. All right, so I don't see any further questions. So what I'm going to do is I am going to be a good soldier, and I am going to make sure that everybody has this information again, okay? I'm sure that Allison and the CAS list will send out this invitation once again with the link to subscribe for our next webinar. But part 2 is going to go over I'll go a little bit more in depth of how unfunded agencies impact things, and how we can actually start using these to start directing our path to ending homelessness. So I hope that we'll see you all on May 28th. I want to thank Allison for inviting me and for setting up this this conversation. I invite all of you, once you see this and you have additional questions, feel free to reach out to me if you have my contact information, or you can get it from Allison. And if you just have other questions and you want to brainstorm, bring your ideas to the table. CAS is a great body, and CAS is really trying to help the COC push things forward, make progress, set policies that make sense and that are going to have a positive impact, not just on the individuals you see every day, but on the wider system. If we can do things 4 or 5% better next year, and we can do things 4 or 5% better the year after that, you're starting to compound positive change that all of a sudden adds up to being proficient and being really, really effective as a system. So we can shrink the change. We can look at the margins for the places where we can have impact in our own system, in our own HMIS data, in our own program type, and then we can make sure that the COC and the CAS are aware of how that interplay is going to help everyone. And what maybe you need support. Maybe you need help because you think, man, I have such a strategic opportunity to increase income or to reduce the number of people who fall into homelessness. And this is where I know we should be putting our effort and energy in order to improve these measures. Those are the ideas that we need to have people voice, and we need to have people who are champions of, and make a stand that everybody can benefit from. So feel free to reach out to myself or Allison, as I said, and thank you all very much for your attention. Really, really appreciate you being here. I hope it wasn't too repetitive for folks who may have heard me drone on about these before, but it bears repeating. It's a little bit of a good and healthy thing to reflect on from time to time about where we're going and what we're trying to do and accomplish. So thank you all. Hope you have a beautiful rest of your Tuesday, and hopefully you will be receiving this recording and follow-up information soon. I'll make sure that we have the materials that I use to go through distributed, and also we'll hope to see you on May 28th. All right? Thank you. I'm going to end the webinar, and I hope you have a really, really great day. Take care all. Thank you. Bye-bye.